I'm Mary Ellen Davis. I'm the Executive Director of ACRL, and we are in the frigid air of Chicago here. Good to see everybody.
Marla?
Hello, everyone. Sure. Thank you, Carolyn. Hello, everyone. Marla Peppers, Associate Dean at California State University, Los Angeles, where it's nice and warm, 77 degrees today.
Oh, rub it in, girl.
Well, that sounds nice. But let's hope some of that heat didn't come from any fires. Are you safe from the fires? It sounds awful.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Mary Ellen. Fortunately, yes, although a couple of days did smell some smoke over here on the campus. This morning, personally, there was a new fire in the foothills, I would say about 10 miles away from my house, but it's pretty small.
All right, fingers crossed. We'll be sending positive thoughts your way.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Brian?
Hi, Brian Rennick from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and just happy to be here. 58 degrees here.
Thank you. Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Payne, ACRL Program Manager for Strategic Initiatives. I'm also your staff liaison. Welcome.
And who is BPL? Hello.
I am Dean Lee. I'm a librarian from Pennsylvania State University. My campus is just north of Philadelphia. Cold but sunny.
Oh, well, that's good. At least the sun is shining, and welcome. You are a new member to this group, and we appreciate you joining us. So thank you very much.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. And last but not least, Elois is the manager of all of these things technical. So we'd like to thank you for your steadfastness in keeping us on track.
You are so welcome.
All right. So I thought that the first thing we do is talk a little bit about the meeting outcomes. We want to have a better understanding of what the role of budget and finance is, the processes and the timelines that we have in relationship to the ACRL budget, a deeper understanding of basic budget principles and practices, documenting what we do, providing executive summaries, individual project reports, and quarterly reports, understanding the work of the committee work plan and how each of you as members contribute to that plan, have a deeper understanding of our ALA finances and the context in which ACRL finances are a part of the ACRL picture, and also to provide an introduction and overview of the ALA operating agreement and the business rules that apply to the manner in which ACRL operates. So this is a list of all of the committee members. I don't know that any of the others will join us. As Mary Ellen said earlier, we did not get RSVPs, so we'll just keep moving along. If you have any questions about any of these individuals, be sure to send me or Mary Ellen an email. Okay, the responsibilities, which really is our charge, to submit an annual recommendation to the board that includes publications, the choice budget, and the long-term investment, which in academic vernacular is endowment. So we advise the board on all of our allocations, including the Friends contributions. Those are gifts that are made to us annually, and sometimes more often than that, by individuals who contribute to our strategic projects and programs. They also help us to develop and manage our fundraising goals for any given year. They support all of the objectives that we have determined as a board are part of the strategic projects and programs. The council is given to the board of directors regarding any fiscal matters related to the division. And that wasn't my phone, I thought it was, I'm sorry. Including, as I said earlier, the publication strategies for any given year. This past year, the Budget and Finance Committee agreed that we would include our core commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion as a part of our charge. It was approved by the board, and so we now have that as an excellent opportunity for us to design a budget that will be supportive of that core commitment. The other thing that I'd like to point out here is that the work that is done in terms of bullet 3 is related also to our operating agreement, which Mary Ellen will talk about at a later point. But the operating agreement has to do with how we function within ALA as a division of the association. Is there anything you want to add, Mary Ellen?
No, that sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you. And I would say that let's welcome Alexia Hudson Ward, who joined us. So
hello, welcome.
Oh, I think we also have Fanny on too.
Oh, Fanny,
Oh,
thank
great.
you, Allison. Welcome,
Hello,
Fanny.
everybody.
Hello. Okay, moving right along. We have face-to-face meetings. We have virtual meetings. Our face-to-face meetings typically take place between two meetings a year, the midwinter meeting and the annual meeting. In one of our meetings, we get an update from the BARC liaison about ALA financial issues. As you know, we're meeting virtually now, so that takes care of part of our virtual work during the year. We have working groups. We use ALA Connect virtual meetings, conference calls, and so forth. And right now we are piloting a hybrid meeting for midwinter 2020, which will encompass some virtual and some face-to-face. Our BARC, let me go back to BARC for a moment. Our BARC liaison is Maggie Farrell, who will remain so until the end of 2020, and then I believe she becomes the treasurer. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, she is. She will be our BARC liaison for this year.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And so for the midwinter 20 meeting, we'll do that hybrid approach and then potentially get some feedback about how we can manage to whether or not we continue it or modify it in some way so that it is effective and useful. The board's role in the ACRL budget is to recommend and monitor all of ACRL's finances and its solvency. We serve as an advisory committee to the board, and we meet jointly with the board during each midwinter conference. This year, we will do a virtual leadership council meeting on Thursday, January 16, 2020, from 2 to 3. This is a change. As you know, we typically have our leadership meetings in person, but we thought we'd try this one out. And then on the 13th, which is a Monday, the ACRL Budget and Finance meeting will also be a virtual meeting, and that will take place between 1:30 and 3. We will send those dates to you again to make sure that you get them. At the ALA Midwinter meeting, there will also be a reception for the Leadership Council on Saturday from 7 to 8:30 a.m. Yes, you are expected to participate, even though it's really early. We would love to see your faces there because it's a way to get to know some of the leadership and people who are actually carrying out the programs that we have provided funding for. Our joint budget and finance committee with the board will be on Saturday, January 25th from 9 to 11. And our regular budget and finance committee will be on Sunday, January 26th from 8 to 10. During the annual conference, we will meet Sunday from 9:30 to noon, and that's typically our longest meeting. Any questions about that? I went through it rather quickly, but you will get notices about it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the sooner I can have those on the calendar, the better. It seems to be a lot of our ACRL entities are having virtual meetings, and in some aspects, and Mary Ellen, please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that in some aspects that might collide with some of the face-to-face meetings. So I want to make sure that I prioritize our meetings over virtual participation. That will also help me to schedule the virtual participation activities for the college library section. So this will be really great to get that detail as soon as possible.
Yeah, in fact, Allison, you might be able to copy and paste those dates and times into the chat box, and then we can send out a follow-up message to the Budget and Finance Committee. We're working on a notice to members to remind them when all the members were asked to schedule, we told them about the switch to virtual midwinter Leadership Council, and now we have a date and time of Friday the 16th. I'm a little surprised to hear that some of your groups might be working against at the same time as ours because we're on the weekend, but they might be using their own software because ACRL staff are not providing the staffing and the software over the weekend for that.
Right.
But it may well be that they're doing it through their own, accounts kind of thing.
Yeah,
so
and
I
right now,
looked.
Yeah, right now, Mary Ellen, it's all rumor. I need to double check, of course, with Megan Griffin, but it does sound like people are using, their own institutions' GoToMeeting or Zoom, and it may not be on you all's scheduler. So I'm hoping to get a better sense of that, pretty soon.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, do keep us posted because we have not tried to avoid section meetings that are on the weekend kind of thing. So.
And I also have a question, if you all don't mind. So since we're having the part virtual and part face-to-face for Midwinter 2020, Carolyn, have you received any inquiry from the ACRL president-elect candidates to come visit our meeting or any other discussion points that they would like to have with this committee or wanting time on the agenda?
I did receive an inquiry, and we have, Mary Ellen and I have agreed that we will schedule some time for them to visit with us.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Good. Okay, good.
We thought we'd follow the practice of the board, Alexia, which is to allow candidates 3 minutes to speak. And we only have one face-to-face meeting of the budget. So if they're available Sunday between 8 and 10:30, we'll do our best to accommodate them. And if they're not, then we could see if they want to come to the virtual meeting, which, as Allison's pasted in the chat, is Monday, January 13th from 1:30 to 3:30. So that's another option for them too.
Okay. No, that's really helpful. They have also approached my section and we're trying to figure it out, but I'm thinking maybe I'll just have them record something and deploy it to the membership.
Yeah, it's also okay to say no. I mean, this is,
Well, I mean, you know, these are hard roles, Mary Ellen. You know, you want people to be successful. You know?
we do. I know. It's a balance. It's always a balance, making time for everything, right?
Yes, yes. That's why I think if I'll give them the option to record, and then, you know, I can send it out and then people can watch it, because I think this is just getting interesting. I mean, I'm excited that we're looking at a different model of deploying midwinter, but there are all these like little gnarly pieces of scheduling that I want us to just, you know, be mindful of as a budgeting committee. Like, what does this look like for the future of ACRL?
I think we're just seeing the beginning of the changes.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that will continue for some time. And it's a good idea for us to pay particular attention to all of the nuances that are coming at us, and try to form some reasonable recommendations for how we respond and react in the future. So thank you for your question. Any other questions? Okay, we can move to the budget timeline now. This chart shows our annual cycle for how the budget is created and approved. In the upper left-hand corner, you will see that the timeline starts in September, and that in order to create this, the staff uses assumptions based on in order to create a preliminary budget for our budget and finance meeting at midwinter. In November is when that takes place. So then we move to later November, when we approve the FY21 budget assumptions for the fall meeting. Now, that also is an executive committee approval from the board. The next iteration is when they actually prepare it based on feedback that they get. And then in our midwinter meeting, we will review that proposed preliminary budget. We also look at the HEPI index, which is the higher education, it is, index for preparing what we will determine as the dues for the following year. It is the higher education price index. Got it right that time, sorry. After the committee reviews that, then the board will take action on our recommendations, and if any changes are necessary, we would make those changes at that time. We would also present them for consideration at midwinter, so it's not necessarily a done deal that we don't make the decision, the board actually does. So it has to go through that process. Any questions on that one? Okay. Then in the spring, the staff does the revised budget based on that midwinter discussion. And at annual, we make the final changes and present them to the board for approval. In addition to that, we make recommendations for the coming year. We look back at the previous year's performance and we monitor the current year. So in other words, we're always paying attention to what's going on in the budget on a regular basis. If we find that we are doing well overall, then we can make some reasonably informed decisions about the future. And if not, then we talk about ways in which we can cut back or make changes so that we remain fiscally stable and sound. I kind of like the idea of us working in this way because it gives us an opportunity to review everything that has occurred from a fiscal perspective over that time period. And so when we look at it, we try to do a 3 fiscal year analysis, and therefore the board can see the ups and downs or the changes that have occurred over that period of time. Any questions about that? Okay. I'm going to now pass the mantle over to Mary Ellen.
Thank you, Carolyn. I appreciate it. And in advance, I'm going to say, buckle your seatbelts. I've got way too many slides for too short a time. So let me say what my goals are, and then I'm happy to dig into questions either at midwinter or after the meeting, or as they come up. But I want to be respectful of your time, and we promised to end at 3 o'clock Central Time. So I will do my best. A number of the slides kind of are just showing you things with a bit of a different graphic, but the same idea, so we'll go through them quickly. What I want to do here is talk about, give you some context for ACRL's budget. So I want to look at the ALA budget, the general funds budget, and the division budgets and ACRL budget, and then save 5 to 10 minutes for Allison to give you some good how-tos about how to read the budget reports that you're going to get as members of the Budget and Finance Committee. So those of you that have been on the committee for a while maybe remember this balance sheet that ALA created that I think is a helpful look at how divisions fit into this overall big picture, because we are part of ALA, and our money is all tied up into the ALA processes and procedures and investments and things like that. So on the left in the blue, you have that $77 million worth of assets, which includes the building, which we think is just sold or waiting for the final paperwork. The inventory of books. Choice through ALA owns a building that ACRL Choice paid for in Middletown, Connecticut. We have a floor of a condominium, and then the long-term investments and the cash. And against that is what we owe people, payroll, debts, that kind of thing. So ACRL is just one part of this budget. And then Lois, if you go to the next slide, please. Then you'll also hear us talking about different funds. So this is a look at ALA's FY20 budget, but I wanted to show it to you as much for what the different funds are. So on the left, you'll see the operating funds, which we'll talk often about general funds and divisions, because one of the other things I'm going to do is give you a mini primer into the operating agreement, which is going to be coming up for negotiation in the next few years, as I understand it from different sources. So the general fund includes the kinds of things like offices and the ALA public programs and office, the public policy and advocacy office, formerly known as the Washington office, the library, the financial office, the membership office, that kind of thing. And then the divisions are the currently 11 divisions, and then of course all the round tables. So you see those funds there, and then you'll see, a capital budget for the buildings and IT, and then there's grants and awards and endowments. So that just gives you that big picture. But as you look at the divisions, one of the things I wanted to point out is that in fiscal year 19, ACRL budgeted about $5 million in revenue and Choice 2.7. So of that 15.9 for divisions, ACRL was nearly half of the amount of funds accounted for in the divisions. This isn't exactly right, because FY20 is not an ACRL conference year, it's a PLA conference year. So our revenues will be reduced by about $2.5 million because we're not having a conference this year. But it does give you sort of a basic picture. Next slide, please, Lois. So where does ALA get its money from? Here you'll see that it's primarily publishing, meetings and conferences with some grants, awards, and dues. I know it's easy for members of organizations and I'm guilty of this too. You belong to something like, I pay dues, I should get this. But I think this slide is a good illustration of how small a portion of the overall income that ALA has are dues. And actually we depend quite a bit on non-dues sources of revenue. And if we look to the next slide, the general funds, which is one of those funds there, you can see their portion of that. So publishing went from $13 million, which included the divisions and roundtables, down to $11 million, which is a significant amount from ALA. And meetings and conferences took out all those division national conferences and division institutes, and this is just what ALA gets from its midwinter meeting, annual conference, and maybe a small institute or two that some of the offices are doing. And the next slide, we look at total ALA expenses. Now, one of the things that ALA does differently than ACRL is they don't seem to account for their staff by project. You may recall me talking about how we keep a time study here at the office. So we charge back staff salary and benefits based on how much time each of us spend on a project. So we know that, you know, we're spending, I think, a couple $100,000 in staff time and benefits to mount that ACRL conference kind of thing. And we include those as part of our expenses in the conference. But here you'll see that ALA has set that aside, and you can see the expenses they have. You know, we may have $13 million in publishing revenue, but where'd it go? Publishing 3.6 is expenses, and then that 23 million, a lot of that is going to be publishing staff. Then on the next slide, here's just the general funds expenses. So that $15 million is now for payroll, and publishing expenses are down to 2.4. So it's just a look, but the pattern is still similar, the major revenue and expense sources. And then the next is just a graph that shows you the same thing. And this graph is a little troubling for me. As many of you may recall, ALA board approved an investment budget for the 3 years to kind of make up for some past deficits that the association had, particularly in technology and advocacy. And so in FY19, the investment budget approved by the board was $2.4 million. And I haven't seen the final close for ALA, but as of the second close, and they go through 4, that deficit was 4.35 million instead of 2.4. So that's a significant gap. And for me personally, a little concerning. So I know that BARC is monitoring that and is looking at, you know, how we can make up for those kinds of things. Now let's go to the division expenses, because I think it helps to see ACRL in the context of the divisions. Remember, the divisions were on that fund balance thing under general funds. So our revenues follow a similar pattern of the importance of publishing and meeting and conferences and things. But I do want to point out publishing and help you recognize what a big part of publishing ACRL and choice are. So here we have, for all divisions, publishing is about $4 million. And at the end of the third close for fiscal year 19, choice was $2.5 million and ACRL was $1.1 million. So when you take those together, 3.6, nearly 3.7 million of that 4.5 is just the division over which you have stewardship of the finances. So publishing is a big piece here. And then of the conferences for FY19, of that 3.3 million, the ACRL conference alone was 2.5 million. And then we had several $100,000 more for things like the Immersion Institute, some of our road shows, and that kind of thing. So we are a significant player when you look at the divisions. And then let's look at the expenses, please, Elois. Thank you. Again, I wouldn't look at expenses this way. When you get the budget from us, you'll see the payroll accounted for by those projects so that we know how much it costs to do the conference, and that our net is truly a net covering all of the indirect costs as well. And then I thought this next chart was illustrative to help you see division's total revenues and expenses, and we're allowed to have that deficit because we're allowed to build up that net asset balance, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And the total revenue that's there, that $13 million, is coincidentally about the cash reserve that ALA has in that scale that I showed you earlier. So of course ALA is not keeping that in a checking account. It's invested in a variety of short-term, medium, and long-term investments so that it can earn some money for them. But this just gives you a picture of total divisions. And then next, thank you, Lois, we'll look at all the divisions broken out. This chart, I showed many of these slides to the board at its strategic planning session 2 weeks ago, and I think this really surprised a number of us about the difference in the divisions. So you'll see, for example, the difference in fund balances that PLA, ACRL, and Choice have fairly significant fund balances. And reminder, ACRL has been aggressively spending its $5 million net asset balance or fund balance down since FY 16 or 17. And then there are divisions that, even though it's against policy, have been allowed to go into deficit. So we have AASL, and I'm hoping for their sake that this changes because their conference is next week, I think. They have a $12,000 net deficit. But I was surprised to see United for Libraries allowed to carry a $362,000 deficit because per the operating agreement, we're supposed to have money on hand to fund some of next year's activities. So divisions are certainly not all equal in terms of the programmatic or financial resources they have. Now let's look at ACRL finances. We have our major sources of revenue and expenses similar to ALA. As I've been saying, we depend on dues, publication, and education, which is not just the conference, but the things like the info-led immersion program, the road shows that we do, the RBMS conference. There's a number of professional development, the webinars, and then our expenses follow those same kind of patterns, as well as we do pay overhead to ALA. So, and more about that later. But particularly for our newer members, I wanted to make sure that it was clear that ALA does not give an allocation to the divisions. The divisions are charged by the operating agreement to generate enough revenue to cover all of its expenses, including its payroll and benefits, as well as in recognition of the building and the heat and lights, we pay an indirect cost back to ALA, and that also helps contribute to ALA's mission. So the rate in FY20 is 26.5%. And it's charged on a variety of things, which I'll get to more in a minute. So this next slide just lets you look at our revenue streams by comparison. The green is the education. That seesaw recognizes that we only have the conference every other year. So when the years we have a conference, our revenues go way up, and the years that we don't, it drops back down. When you've got a $2.5 million bulge, it's a big impact on the budget. You can see that, let's see, membership dues have been fairly stable because the Board and Budget and Finance Committee have been raising the dues. Just that teensy little bit is allowed by the HEPI index. So it's sort of that consumer price index. Only we look at the HEPI one. Goes up a little bit. Your dues have gone up $1 or at the most $2 over the last, say, 10 years. And then another look at the same picture, just so you can see the variety of percentages in terms of how much of our revenue comes from which source. So in a conference year, member services is only 15%, where education is 65%, but in a non-conference year, like in 2016, publishing takes up a bigger chunk, as do membership, because our education drops back to only 30%. So again, just following that pattern. And then the next slide, the expenses do that same kind of pattern. You can see, Lois, if you'd go up one more slide, please. Big expenses for education the years we have the conference, and then it drops back down. I'd say one of the challenging ones is that red one. You'll see that is continuing to go up, and we'll talk about that more in another slide, but we continue to provide more things to members at a rate faster than the revenue is coming in to cover those things. So there may be some hard decisions to make over the next few years, depending on how things go. And then the next chart just, again, makes it a little easier to look at in terms of what percentages of expenses. So you can see member services is 44% of our expenditures in 2018, but with a much smaller percentages of the revenue. So there's that gap. That's not unusual for associations. Associations typically have other sources of revenue than just dues to cover member services, but it's just something to point out and pay attention to. And then this last one, just a quick look at net revenue, and you can see again in the conference years how strong our net revenue has been. And then as we get into 2018, the deliberate spend down of the net asset balance in order to invest in member programs and services and not just have $5 million sitting there not working for the members. The Board and Budget and Finance Committee we're on a deliberate path to make sure that we're investing in things that will serve the members well. And then this next slide just shows you the importance of conference revenue and how the overhead, which I mentioned that we give to ALA to support its mission and pay for the heat and lights, we actually pay ALA more in overhead than we are able to keep in net for the conference for ACRL's mission and programs and services. So it's a tension, and we're looking at how we can make sure that there's a strong enough net from the conference to support all the other programs and services that ACRL offers. And then set against that, of course, is one of our big challenges is membership, that we have seen a continual decline since 1969. That was before the division dues structure changed, but after a peak in 2007, there's been a pretty steady decline. We used to be able to count on getting a little bump from the conference years, but the last time that happened was in 2015, and it was a very tiny bump. So now the conference, Mary Jane Petrowski, our associate director, and I were talking about it and saying that now the conference seems to more just slow down the decline in membership rather than actually boost it. And inserted here, you'll see that our decline is not that unlike that of ALA, similar kind of pattern, similar decline. So, as the numbers of people in the profession decline, and as there are more choices for people to spend their time and energy on, it may not be something that we're able to change, but again, something to be aware of. And then we look at member services. Here we have the cost of member services. This is the thing that I mentioned I'd show you more later. So if you look at 2017-18, that's a lot more money we're spending on members than we're taking in from dues. So that gap has continued to widen as we've added more things to support member programs and services. Project Outcome just being the latest one. And I think these are good things to do. We may have to make some choices as we go forward in the next 3 to 5 years about which ones we can continue to support or where we need to generate additional income if we're going to support them all. And the kinds of things we charge to member expenses include things like advocacy, the support of the board, the support of committees and chapters, section expenses, any advisory services that we do for free, like people phone and email and ask for background information, development of standards, discussion groups, interest groups, our awards program, ACRL, which is fully open access and online only, info lit initiatives, our scholarly communication initiatives, all those things we've added over time because members have told us they care about them. All right. Another possible revenue stream for us, one that we just started using this year and that the Board and Budget and Finance Committee intentionally built up since the 90s, is a long-term investment. And ALA has long-term investments, and you'll hear me speak incorrectly, I suppose, calling them either LTIs or endowments. So, an endowment they're both restricted funds, and they've tended to be used rather interchangeably around ALA and ACRL. So at the close of 2019, ALA's endowment value was $46 million. And of that $46 million, ACRL on the next slide had 4.9, almost $5 million. And if you add in the choice one on the next slide, you'll see that ACRL and choice had about $5.5 million of that $46 million long-term investment. And this is all fund accounting, as I'm sure the monies at your universities and colleges are too. It's not like there's any account out there in a bank or an investment firm that says ACRL or choice. There's a big ALA one, and they keep paper records so they know how much we have to draw upon. But what was useful about this long-term investment is that in FY19, we were able to take about $125,000 in appreciation from the long-term investment to move it into the operating budget to support ACRL programs and services. And that's what the board had intended all those many years ago when they first petitioned ALA to be allowed to create a long-term investment, to create another revenue stream. Okay, how are we doing? Okay, I knew this was going to be hard, so very quickly on the operating agreement, just the basics. It lays out the relationship between ALA and the divisions. It lays out the business rules about how we're going to work together. And this is in your budget and finance manual if you want to read the whole thing. Why I'm making sure you're aware of it is that as part of the work of SCOE, the Steering Committee on Organizational Effectiveness, another group was created to look at the financial relationship between ALA and the divisions. And I keep hearing from the executive director that the operating agreement has to be looked at. So I suspect in the next year or two, depending on what the new executive director wants to do, that some of these business rules may be looked at. So on the next slide, I've mentioned overhead, and this just gives you an idea of how the rates have changed over the years from as low as 18% to it's been about 26.5% for the last few years. And we pay 100% of overhead rate on revenues from things like conferences and exhibits, registrations, only 50% on publishing, which is including webinars. But we do pay things like unrelated business income tax. And if you want to look at the overhead comparison on the next slide, you'll see ALA as a whole, what it collected in overhead, because it charges overhead to its own revenue generating units as well. So publishing, ALA Publishing paid $2.8 million. And on the next slide, you'll see how the divisions, the difference in the divisions and what they paid in overhead. So again, you can see the PLA, ACRL, and ALSC are some of the bigger overpayers, where ASCLA paid $3,700 and United for Libraries paid $7,900, while PLA in 2018 paid $859,000 and ACRL in 2019 paid $746,000. Again, indicative of the difference in our years of conference. And our combined overhead here, this is shown here in a chart. So what this means on the next slide is that divisions are allowed to maintain negative fund balances if they carry over that net asset, which I've talked about, where the general fund units kind of have to start over again. Any revenue they earn over their expenses, they go back to support the rest of the ALA's mission. But us divisions being able to carry over some net assets have allowed us to have some money on hand when we said, oh, let's do project outcome and let's make it free to everybody. Then we had resources on hand that we could invest. We didn't have to come up with the resources in the same year we were going to spend them. And we can tap into those long-term investments because of the rules of the operating agreement of a payout rate of up to 3 to 5% a year, which the ALA endowment trustees manage. So this last year, as I said, we took $125,000. So what does it look like at the end of the day for ACRL and Choice? What kind of resources are you managing for the organization? In this next slide, you'll see that at the end of FY19, we had $3.3 million in our net asset and $4.9 in our long-term investment, and Choice had $2.5 and $500,000 there. And just one more look for ACRL, you can see those lines going up, that, you know, the investment is doing well. We've seen the advantage of the good years of the stock market, and then as we've intentionally been spending down our net asset balance. Whew. So I actually gave Allison 12 whole minutes. She said she only needed 5, so I will take a deep breath there and see if anybody has any questions at the moment. Or again, my purpose was not thinking you could regurgitate all this, but just to give you a big picture, highlight look, so that you knew, like, oh, I heard something about that before, let me dig into it deeper later. Or I just PowerPointed slided you into exhaustion. I totally understand. Well, you can certainly put questions in the chat box later or email Carolyn and me later, but then I will turn it over to Allison, who's going to show you some practical reporting tools we give you.
Okay, thank you, Mary Ellen. So I'll give a good overview of reporting that you will receive. So in advance of midwinter and annual, as well as in advance of spring and the fall board meetings, staff will prepare a quarterly budget report, and we will share them with the board and the Budget and Finance Committee. These reports will give an overview of ACRL's actual revenues and expenses against our budget. In addition to the quarterly report, staff will prepare a narrative overview to accompany each report. So we currently are wrapping up fiscal year 19, and we will be sharing with you the fiscal year 19 fourth quarter report in the coming weeks. In your orientation packet, FYI 5 is an example of a quarterly report. So we can go on to the next slide. So here's a screenshot of the quarterly report. Okay, I think it was the one, if you could go back one slide, Lois, please, thanks. So this section shows our major revenue streams. So we have membership, publications, and education. We also include the actual against the quarterly budget and the annual budget. We also show the actuals from 2 years ago for ACRL due to our ACRL conference. So those numbers are more meaningful for you to look at. For choice, we just show the previous year. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So the second part of the quarterly report on the second page will show the expenses, and it's lined up the same way as revenue. So we have membership, publication, and education. All right, and then the third page will include the ending, the net asset balance and the nets for choice and ACRL. So throughout the year, the net revenue can often show a deficit as we recognize expenses immediately for professional development, but do not recognize revenue until after the event. To help you judge how the actual financials is faring, again, you can refer to the quarterly budget for 2 years ago. All right, does anyone have any questions about these reports?
And if I could, thank you, Allison, that was helpful. If I could just add, as members of the Budget and Finance Committee, as you start to work with these, you might have ideas of different ways to present the information. So we are totally flexible. If you have some, if you're like, oh, it would help me if I looked at it this way or that way, feel free to suggest things. We're not wed to this. We're happy to consider ways to, these reports are meant to make it easier for you to make decisions about ACRL and its finances.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so the next slide, we have the dashboard metrics, which is something that the Budget and Finance Committee prepared. I think it was a few years ago we started doing this, but it gives you a good overview of membership, and then there's actually a second page of this that shows more of the budget detail at a high level glance. And then, so since this is something that we mainly use for the Budget and Finance Committee and the board to look at, if there's any charts or graphs that you think would be particularly useful, we're always happy to add in a new chart or whatever might be helpful for you to look at our budget. Okay, so here's another, here is an example of the infographic. This is a really a neat project that the Budget and Finance Committee developed last year, and I think it was with thanks to Brian Rennick and some of his staff, and they did an excellent job of putting together ACRL's expenses in a way that membership can see at a high level where we're spending our money. And so this was actually published in our annual report last year, and for our annual report this year, we will include an updated version. Okay, so in addition to the quarterly reports that I went over earlier, the Budget and Finance Committee will also receive individual project budgets. So these go really into the weeds and include detail by each project where we're for our revenues and expenses. And this slide shows a screenshot of our memberships project and our revenues that we generate for membership. And so there's a really detailed explanation on that previous slide. You can see where we detail like how much we're expecting for dues revenue and how we came to that number. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. And so this is, oh, just one back, please. Thanks. So this is the second part of the membership project. These 5,000 lines show our expenses. So as Mary Ellen mentioned earlier in the presentation, each staff presents, does a time study, and so we charge those back to the individual projects so we know how much staff time is used for each project. All right, next slide, please. So this is a project, this is an example of a project that does not generate revenue. As you can see at the bottom, it has a negative net balance. Okay, and so here's just an example of one of our serial publications. As you can see, we do not generate revenue from subscriptions because this publication has been open access since 2014. Okay, and so this is just the end of the historical executive summary, and this will show on the far right column, you can see the current budget, which at midwinter, you'll see fiscal year 21 updated there, and then the columns to the left are all of the historical data. And then in addition to the historical data in the roll-up in the executive summary, we also present historical data for each of the projects. All right, so does anyone have any questions about the reports? Okay, in that case, I will go ahead and turn the mic over to Carolyn.
Thank you. So you have received a brief recap of the projects that are outlined, excuse me, for our fiscal year 20. And what we will do is develop the budget assumptions for 21. We'll take a look at the choice financial outlook. We will continue to evaluate the dashboard metrics. We'll pay attention to our dues and determine if there should be any new rate and make a recommendation for the board. We will look at the Friends distribution and fundraising activities, and likewise make recommendations if there are any activities that we would like to propose. We will advise the board on the long-term investment transfers, monitoring performance in that area as well. We will continue to conduct orientations for any new board members and old ones who would like a refresher. That is acceptable as well. We will monitor the effects of any discounted student fees on memberships, which we have maintained for the past 3 years that I can remember. It is hoped that we will continue to, or at least grow our student participation in ACRL. So that's a significant entity within our budget structure, in my opinion. The infographic, of course, needs updating every year, and we will pay attention to that. We will demonstrate how those funds are being used in terms of programs and services. And we will also monitor the net asset balance and make recommendations to the board about how those funds should be utilized. So pretty much this is a recap of all the things that we will be doing during this fiscal year that we're in, and monitoring our assets very carefully, hopefully giving sound advice. At this point, I will ask for questions or concerns that anyone may have.
I'm sorry, I was in mid-chew, like having late lunch. But I do have a question. So first, both to Allison and Mary Ellen, thank you so much. I know you all put so much hard work in this, and you're tasked to do so many other things. And so everything that you always present to us is so clear, and I really do appreciate it. I've asked this question, I think maybe on my first year on this committee. And as I look to sunset an enjoyable tenure on this committee, I also wanted to kind of put out there this idea that perhaps some of our budget assumptions should speak to the volatility that we now have really seen happen within higher education, and subsequently how we see that impacting membership and initiatives. And so in other words, you know, without question now, over the time that I've been on the committee, we have been faced with a lot of institutional closures and mergers. That looks like that is going to continue to happen through fiscal year 2025 at a minimum. And what we have seen, at least from CLS's perspective, excuse me, is that there is, you know, so there's the stress of that, which pressurizes membership, but then those institutions that are still in the fight to survive, there's this request now for more training around change management and leadership, you know, project management, how, you know, stewarding the value of libraries, et cetera. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there as a question statement around whether or not we see some potential in this budget to reflect those possibilities.
So I'll jump in. You are going to get the budget assumption draft that the staff worked on by 5 o'clock today, I guess. Allison, we just kind of did our first draft, and we're going to ask you to try and skim through that before our meeting on Thursday. And we do mention some of those volatility kinds of things. Now, if you think, Alexi, has specific projects you want to suggest, that'd be a good time to bring them up. We can look at it, because then the board is going to look at these assumptions on November 18th, and those are kind of our marching orders for developing those spreadsheets that Allison was showing you. I know that we have a couple groups working on new roadshows, and also a self-paced change management kind of web-based thing that would be theoretically free. So we are trying to look at some of those things. And yes, I would say that if there's specific kinds of things you think we need to add, then I think we're at that point now. Then we have to look at what do we want to stop doing, because I think the spigot has slowed down, and there's also a lot of uncertainty about what resources divisions will be allowed to keep as we begin to negotiate, you know, depending on whether the SCOE recommendations are adopted, how much more they change, how the operating agreement gets negotiated, when, and, you know, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of uncertainties in the budget. And so I encourage you to read that. And I wish there had been more time. Just too many things due at the same amount of time, I'm afraid. And think, you know, have some ideas that you want to suggest. And it's not too late at midwinter either. We'll do our first draft. But if there are member initiatives that CLS wants to bring to the board, because I think they really need these kinds of things, the board considers those sorts of activities off cycle as well.
Okay, thank you.
I want to respect that your time, that's 3:02. I can stay a few more minutes if there's some other questions, but I recognize some people have meetings back to back. So if you're 2 minutes late for your 3 o'clock, or you need to run to get somewhere, I want to thank all of you for making time to do this, and remind you that we're getting together again Thursday. In fact, I got here a minute late because I was desperately trying to get into my Zoom meeting for Thursday on budget assumptions instead of my orientation meeting, because I've been working on budget assumptions all morning. My brain was in the wrong place.
Well, we thank you very much, Mary Ellen, and thank you to Allison and Elois also for your hard work on this. I sincerely appreciate your efforts, and we look forward to our next meeting.
And thank you, Carolyn, for your leadership. And it was good seeing many of you virtually.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn, and everyone else who came. And look for some fun reading for your evening tonight, tomorrow.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.